All right, welcome back. This is going to be a whirlwind tour, really, really fast, of the Gospel of Matthew. There's so much to say that I can say almost nothing, and so I aspire to say nothing about the Gospel of Matthew. Just kind of things to think about that we should talk about more when we are having our class. Matthew begins with a genealogy, and we've noticed a lot of genealogies spread out throughout the book of Genesis. So and so begat so and so begat so and so. These long lines of father and son, etc., etc., which seem to be very important to the human authors of Genesis. And Matthew's Gospel, and therefore the New Testament also, as Matthew's Gospel is placed first, start out this way. And very interestingly, there's a lot of play with numbers, numerology, that's taken up into this genealogy by the evangelist Matthew. There's sets of names that work out to 14 and 14 and 14. He says this. And there's also seems to be perhaps some wordplay as well. If you look at the Aramaic or the Hebrew, we have Adam, we have Adam at the beginning. And then we have David right smack in the middle. And then we have the Christ, or in Hebrew, the Messiah. So we have Aleph, Dalet, Mem, Adam, spelling out the kind of anchor points of the genealogy, which points, it seems, perhaps to the new Adam. We have then this infancy narrative. We're not reading the Gospel of Luke, but there's a different infancy narrative in the Gospel of Luke with different emphases. In Luke's Gospel, a lot more attention to Mary. Here, the attention is especially to Joseph, to Jesus' human father, or as the church has often said, foster father, as he is not the biological father of Christ. There's also the kings. These kings are introduced. They're not actually identified as a threesome, but these rulers from the east somewhere who come looking for this figure because of signs they've seen in the skies. So there's a star that appears over the region, and then ultimately over the area, and then ultimately over the town of Bethlehem. And these kings follow this star, and they interact with another king, Herod, who is not happy and not pleased with the prophetic assertion that a new king is to be born in his territory. And so he naturally sends out an edict to have all children, all boys under the age of 2 murdered. And so that's a big event in early Christian history, the early church. These are sometimes identified as the first martyrs because they die as a testimony, as a witness to Christ, even though they're not conscious of that. Very interesting part of the church's thinking about martyrdom and about who Christ is, and how radical is the incarnation, is this moment of the fullness of time. So we have Joseph, who has multiple dreams, divine visions, kind of telling him what he needs to do, guiding him through these days in the vicinity of Christ's conception and birth and early years. There's also a lot of biblical references. I don't know if you noticed this in the early couple of chapters of Matthew, actually continuing throughout, but especially early on. Why all this reference to the Old Testament? Very explicit quotations from the Old Testament. Think about that, all this appeal to the Old Testament, and especially Matthew's Gospel in particular ways. All the Gospels do this, but Matthew has a particular way of doing this. John the Baptist is very central. He was significant in John's Gospel, now again significant, but with again different different feel, different emphases. He is in some way quite close to Christ, it seems. He's anticipating, predicting Christ's coming. And again, many biblical references are deployed here by the evangelist, by Matthew, about John the Baptist. And Christ repeatedly brings up John the Baptist and keeps adverting to him, as do others in the vicinity of Christ's ministry, connecting him in some way to John the Baptist. He goes and gets baptized by Christ. Christ goes and gets baptized by John the Baptist, which John is not pleased about initially, but agrees to do. And ultimately, John is beheaded. Spoiler alert, if you're not there yet in the text, is killed by Herod. This is a later Herod, related to a descendant of the earlier Herod who went after Jesus when he was a baby. So John the Baptist is a very significant figure in play somehow in relation to Christ in Matthew's gospel. Christ begins his public ministry, and very early on in chapters 5, 6, and 7, we have this major extended teaching by Christ. This is what this new thing that I'm doing is about. Sorry, it's not meant as an advertisement for the Lord of the Rings, but that's what I'm wearing on my t-shirt. So the Sermon on the Mount is full of many well-known kind of tropes from the gospel, including the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, those who mourn, the peacemakers, those who are persecuted for my name's sake, etc. And this is kind of a new version of the law, it seems. So a little bit of a spoiler looking forward to our next reading in our next class, to Exodus. What is Jesus doing here as Matthew records it, and how does it evoke any particular Old Testament figures, especially thinking forward to Exodus and thinking about the way early Christians are encountering the text of the gospel as well as the text of the Old Testament, and in conversation with each other. Also part of the Sermon on the Mount is the introduction of a new way of prayer. Jesus has some things to say about prayer, and those culminate in his giving a new prayer, the Our Father. So more on that in our class. He also says towards the conclusion of his this sermon on top of a mountain, he says, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." So this is somehow, whatever its relation to the law, it certainly doesn't sound like it's a relaxation of the law by any means. If anything, it sounds like it's a kind of intensification of the law. So what is the relation between what Jesus is doing and the Torah, the law of the people of Israel as given to Moses in the book of Exodus? Another spoiler. So there are a lot of parables in Matthew's gospel, and I should have said to start out this brief overview that we should be especially on the lookout for likenesses and differences with John's gospel, which we've already read. John pays less attention to these parables, lots of parables in the synoptic gospels. They're parables that are especially agrarian in their kind of milieu. There's a lot about the fields, about planting and sowing and the harvest, and then also later about the vineyard the planting of vineyards and workers. So we should think a little bit about the parables as Jesus uses this particular genre, which he makes very famous, even if other great teachers have used them as well. There are a lot of miracles spread out over the course of Jesus' life as recorded in Matthew's gospel. There are the miraculous feedings, not just one, but two feedings of 5,000, and then again of 4,000 with a very little bit of bread and fish. And there are healings, some of them identified specifically, particular instances, and then description or identifications of just groups that he healed, all who came to him with various diseases of all sorts, all sorts of illness and disease, and then all sorts of disability, blindness, deafness, lameness, a withered hand, and then also demoniacs. He also performs what amounts to exorcisms. He gets rid of demons. And there are various interesting stories about this particular kind of miracle in Matthew's gospel. We have then, as we march forward and move towards the climax of the gospel, we have the transfiguration account where Jesus goes up on a mountain with Peter, James, and John, and he's changed in his physical appearance, and he appears with Moses and Elijah on either side of him. And coming down the mountain after this ecstatic, exquisite, extraordinary, epiphanic event, there's a discussion between Jesus and Peter about who Jesus is, and Peter declares, "You are the Christ." And this concludes with Jesus saying, you're right about this, and as a result, I designate you as Peter, as the rock on which I will build my church. This also leads, it seems, immediately to Jesus beginning to predict more and more clearly his own suffering and death. His disciples are not happy about this. Peter in particular takes him to task for this. But he says, this is the way it's going to be, and don't get in my way. And the march towards Jerusalem continues. There is a prepared entry into Jerusalem, which gives us the blueprint, so to speak, for Palm Sunday, for the beginning of Holy Week, leading into the high holy days of the Catholic Christian year, the Triduum, so-called Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter at the end of this week. And then we have, kind of some stepping forward and back, in and out around Jerusalem and its vicinity. And Jesus goes in and he cleanses the temple. This event is usually called, where he goes in and turns over the money changers and kicks people out of the temple for abusing the place that's to be the place of worship of our God, the living God. And the tension with the Jewish leadership increases and finally boils over. There's ongoing inquiry and interrogation and dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees about different points of theological issue. And eventually these boil over, as I said, and Judas becomes involved in this plot, basically, to get rid of this dangerous figure, whatever it is that Jesus is doing. It's a threat to a good number of people, it seems. So Judas sells out his leader and Lord. And this takes place kind of overlapping with the period of what's often referred to as the Passion account. We have the Last Supper, which points towards the Eucharistic liturgy, among other things. We have no foot washing, and we have the betrayal of Judas carried out in painstaking detail. The Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus goes to pray. We have then his trial at night, his mocking and crucifixion, with criminals on either side of him. You'll note, if you know some things about this from either earlier exposure to the Gospels or from pop culture, that Matthew's version is not exactly like John's or Luke's. Here the criminals, they condemn Christ as well. There's another variation in Luke where one condemns him, the other one is on his side. So this is different. So then we have the resurrection accounts. Jesus doesn't stay dead, and people come to his tomb looking for him, the women, and he off stage, so to speak, he rises from the dead and meets his disciples and gives them a final commission in the last few verses of the gospel. It says to go and preach to all the people in the world and baptize them while you're at it, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So be looking for similarities and differences with the Gospel of John, and also be looking towards the Old Testament back and forth as you're reading Matthew's Gospel. And I think, short as it is, that's enough for today. Thanks very much. See you soon.